Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air on the Tasman Peninsula is different. It's clean, sharp, carrying the scent of salt from the Southern Ocean and the deep, damp earth of ancient eucalyptus forests. On a calm day, the water in the bay is a placid sheet of sapphire, reflecting a sky that feels vast and empty. It is a place of profound, almost haunting beauty. And it is a place built on pain. The Port Arthur Historic Site, on the southeast coast of Tasmania, was once a penal colony, a hell on earth for the worst convicts of the British Empire. Between 1833 and 1877, it was a place of systematic, scientific punishment. Its sandstone ruins, now elegant and skeletal against the green lawns, were once a grinding machine for the human spirit. The penitentiary, the asylum, the dreaded separate prison where men were kept in silent solitary confinement, hooded whenever they were moved, to break them completely. These are not just buildings, they are monuments to a brutal past, a past that draws tourists from around the world, who walk the manicured lawns and whisper in the hollowed-out shells of history, trying to imagine the lives of the men who suffered there. It is a place where history is not just remembered, it is felt. On the morning of Sunday, April 28, 1996, the feeling was one of peace. The autumn sun was bright but gentle, a perfect day for sightseeing. The nation itself was in a period of transition. Just 7 weeks earlier, a federal election had ended 13 years of Labour Party rule, bringing conservative leader John Howard to power. There was a sense of a new chapter beginning. At Port Arthur, the day unfolded like any other Sunday in tourist season. Tour buses arrived, families spread out picnic blankets, and visitors wandered through the grounds, their cameras clicking, capturing the juxtaposition of colonial architecture against the wild Tasmanian landscape. In the Broad Arrow Cafe, a popular lunch spot housed in a former storehouse near the entrance of the site, the lunch rush was beginning. The air was filled with the mundane and happy sounds of any tourist cafe on a beautiful day, the clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversations in a dozen different accents, the laughter of children. No one in that cafe, no one on that peninsula, no one in all of Australia could possibly know that they were standing at the precipice of a moment that would shatter the nation's sense of self. They could not know that the history of pain at Port Arthur was about to gain a new terrible chapter, one written not in leg irons and lashings, but in cordite and cartridges, and they could not know that in the coming minutes, an ordinary Sunday was about to become a permanent scar on the national psyche, a day of such incomprehensible violence that it would force an entire country to look in the mirror and ask a fundamental question. Who are we, and what kind of society do we want to be? Today, we are not only examining the crime itself, a methodical and chilling act of mass murder. We are dissecting what followed. We are exploring the anatomy of a legislative response. This is the story of how the actions of one man, a deeply disturbed individual named Martin Bryant, triggered a political and social chain reaction of almost unprecedented speed and scope. It is the story of how a nation, reeling from unimaginable grief, managed to achieve in just 12 days what other nations have debated for decades, without resolution. This is the anatomy of a reckoning. To understand the cataclysm of April 28th, one must first attempt to understand the man who set it in motion. Martin Bryant was born in Hobart, Tasmania, in May of 1967. From his earliest years, it was clear to those around him that he was different. His developmental milestones were delayed. He was a slow learner, socially awkward, and prone to bizarre and often cruel behavior. His sister Lindy would later recall his fondness for pulling the fins off fish and tormenting animals. At school, he was a ghost, a target. He was bullied relentlessly for being odd, for not understanding social cues, for his vacant expression. His teachers noted his profound isolation and his disruptive, often volatile temper. He would throw tantrums, scream, and lash out. A school psychologist in 1974 described him as disconnected from reality, aggressive, and lacking emotion. The formal assessments from his childhood paint a consistent and bleak picture. A boy with a significantly low IQ, somewhere in the range of 66, which is classified as an intellect. He was diagnosed with conduct disorder, and later examinations would suggest he had traits consistent with Asperger's syndrome, though this remains a point of debate among forensic psychologists who have studied the case. The label is less important than the reality. He was a boy who simply could not process the world in the way others did. What is not debated is the portrait of a young man drifting through life without anchor or purpose. He was emotionally immature, with the reasoning and social skills of a child. Trapped in an adult's body, he struggled to hold down jobs, often being fired for incompetence or for his unnerving interactions with colleagues and customers. He worked briefly as a gardener and a handyman, but couldn't maintain the focus required. He was known for pulling strange pranks, for a lack of empathy that bordered on the sadistic. He would tell neighbors his father had died, just to see their reaction. He had a habit of grabbing the steering wheel of cars while others were driving. He was a deeply isolated figure, living in a world of his own making, a world fueled by fantasy and a growing gnawing sense of resentment against a world he could not understand, and which, in turn, did not understand him. His father, Maurice, a gentle and kind man who worked on the Hobart wharves, tried desperately to connect with his son, to provide him with structure and love. He protected Martin, found him work, and tried to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But Maurice was fighting a losing battle against his son's profound and ingrained pathologies. The first major turning point in Martin Bryant's life came not through an act of violence, but through a strange and unlikely friendship. In 1987, while looking for gardening work, the then 20-year-old Bryant met Helen Harvey, a 54-year-old heiress to the Tattersall's lottery fortune. Harvey was as eccentric as Bryant was odd. She was a recluse who lived in a sprawling, dilapidated mansion called Torresville in the Hobart suburb of Newtown. The house was filled with over a dozen dogs, and somewhere between 30 and 40 cats. She had inherited her wealth but lived in squalor, estranged from her family. She saw in the strange young man a kindred spirit, someone as disconnected from the conventional world as she was. Bryant became her constant companion, her gardener, her handyman, and eventually her housemate. Their relationship was deeply codependent, and by all accounts platonic. Harvey showered Bryant with gifts, at least 5 cars in just a few years, clothes, expensive watches, and eventually trips abroad. In return, Bryant provided a strange sort of companionship. Above to outsiders, it was a bizarre pairing, the wealthy, aging eccentric, and the simple, unpredictable young man. For Bryant, this period was a fantasy come to life. He was suddenly wealthy by proxy, freed from the need to work and able to indulge his whims. But the stability was an illusion. In October of 1992, Helen Harvey was killed in a car accident on a quiet suburban street. Bryant was in the passenger seat and sustained minor injuries. The official cause was that Harvey had swerved to avoid an oncoming car after her dogs, who were always in the front with her, became agitated. But questions have always lingered. Bryant had a well-known habit of grabbing the steering wheel. He gave several contradictory accounts of the crash to police. His reaction was noted as strangely flat, without emotion. Whatever the truth, the outcome was transformative. Harvey, who had no other close relatives, had made Bryant the sole beneficiary of her will. At the age of 24, this intellectually disabled, socially inept young man inherited a fortune worth over $500,000 Australian dollars, a considerable sum in the early 1990s. His father, Maurice, had hoped the inheritance might provide Martin with a stable future. He was appointed the guardian of the estate, managing the money for his son. But the new wealth only untethered Martin completely. He was impossible to control. His spending was erratic, his behavior more so. Maurice, who had his own struggles with depression, found the burden of his son's wealth and instability overwhelming. In August 1993, less than a year after Helen Harvey's death, Maurice Bryant drove to the family's small farm, tied a weight belt around his neck, and drowned himself in a dam. He left a simple note pinned to the front door, reportedly reading, "For Martin." The two people who had provided any semblance of structure in Bryant's life were now gone. He was alone, wealthy, and adrift in a sea of his own pathologies. With unrestricted access to his inheritance, Bryant traveled the world. But these trips only highlighted his profound isolation. He flew to London, to Amsterdam, to Los Angeles. He reported feeling desperately lonely, unable to connect with anyone. The money could buy tickets and hotel rooms, but it couldn't buy him the social skills he so desperately lacked. His loneliness festered into a bitter and paranoid rage. He felt that people were laughing at him, looking down on him. He became an injustice collector, cataloging every perceived slight, every snicker, every moment of rejection. Back in Tasmania, his focus shifted. He began to collect firearms. Australia, at that time, had a patchwork of inconsistent gun laws that varied from state to state. In Tasmania, the laws were among the most permissive in the nation. It was startlingly easy for a private citizen, even one with a documented history of psychological issues like Bryant, to purchase high-powered, military-style semi-automatic rifles. He applied for and was granted a Category A and B firearms license. He didn't need to belong to a gun club or provide a detailed reason for wanting the weapons. In 1993, he walked into a Hobart gun shop and purchased a Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, a military-grade weapon, over the counter. He later acquired a Belgian-made FN FAL, another powerful semi-automatic rifle, and several other firearms through private sales, which were even less regulated. His fascination with these weapons grew into an obsession. They provided him with a sense of power and control that he had never experienced. He would spend hours watching violent action movies, particularly Rambo, First Blood, fantasizing about retribution against a world he felt had wronged him. In late 1995, he used a portion of his inheritance to make an offer on a small guest house property called Seascape, a beautiful, isolated bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean not far from Port Arthur. The property was owned by an older couple, David and Sally Martin. Bryant became fixated on owning it. The Martins, however, were not interested in selling to him, reportedly finding him strange and unsettling. They accepted another offer, which later fell through. Bryant, feeling snubbed, then increased his own offer substantially and eventually purchased the property. But the transaction left him feeling humiliated. This perceived slight, like so many others in his life, became a focal point for his simmering rage. He believed the Martins were part of a conspiracy of local people who disliked him and wanted him gone. His paranoia deepened. He stopped taking the antidepressant medication prescribed to him. In the months leading up to April 1996, his behavior became even more alarming. He would tell the few acquaintances he had that he was going to do. The stage was set, the actor was ready, the weapons were loaded. The night before the massacre, Bryant slept poorly. He set his alarm for 6 a.m., but according to his later statements, he didn't really need it. He was wired, energized by a terrifying sense of purpose. April 28, 1996 began not at Port Arthur, but at the Seascape property. His first targets were the people at the top of his grievance list, David and Sally Martin. He drove to their nearby property. The precise sequence of events is known only from Bryant's own confused and often contradictory confessions, but the outcome is brutally clear. He stabbed David Martin to death, then shot him. He lay in wait for Sally, whom he ambushed and killed when she returned. He left their bodies inside their home. The first two victims were dead before the sun had reached its peak. With the Martins dead, Bryant returned to Seascape and gathered his arsenal. He packed a large yellow sports bag with his two semi-automatic rifles, the Colt AR-15 and the FN FAL, along with a shotgun, a handgun, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He placed the bag on the passenger seat of his yellow Volvo 244 sedan, a car he drove everywhere, and which had become something of a local curiosity. He locked the doors to the guest house, and then he drove south, towards the Tasman Peninsula, towards the Port Arthur historic site. He stopped at a service station, buying a lighter and a bottle of tomato sauce. He continued on, driving through the small town of Fawcett. A local man who knew Bryant saw him and waved. Bryant stared straight ahead, emotionless. He paid the entrance fee at the Port Arthur toll booth, parked his car near the Broad Arrow Cafe, and walked inside, carrying the heavy bag. He ordered a meal, quiche and salad, and a cup of tea. He sat on the outdoor deck, overlooking the ruins and the bay. To other patrons, he would have appeared unremarkable. A young man with long blonde hair, eating lunch alone. Witnesses later described him as looking around, as if he were counting the people present. He made a few odd comments to those nearby, remarking that there were a lot of WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, around, and not many Japanese tourists. After he finished his meal, he walked back inside the crowded cafe. He placed his tray on a rack, turned, and set his large bag on an empty table. He unzipped it. He pulled out the AR-15, which was fitted with a scope. He routed a 30-round magazine, chambered a round, and aimed it at the back of a man sitting at a nearby table. That man was Mo Yi-ing, a tourist from Malaysia. His partner, Su Leng Chung, was sitting opposite him. The first shot was fired. What followed was not a panicked, indiscriminate spray of bullets. It was a methodical, systematic execution. Bryant moved through the small, crowded cafe with a terrifying calm. He shot Su Leng Chung. He turned to the next table, killing Mick Sargent and wounding Sargent's friend, Jason Winter, who was hit by shrapnel. He fired with precision, often at close range, targeting his victims' heads and torsos. The cafe, a moment before a scene of peaceful lunch or chatter, was transformed into a charnel house. The noise was deafening, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. People screamed, dove for cover under tables, or froze in sheer terror. Bryant continued his circuit, table by table. He killed Anthony Nightingale. He killed Kevin and Raymond Sharp, a father and son. He killed Walter, Sarah, and Gerald Broom, 3 members of one family. He shot and killed Tony and Sarah Castan. He moved towards the back of the cafe, killing Andrew Mills and the Salmons, Elva and Kevin. He killed Janet and Neville Quinn, who were visiting from New South Wales. Within the space of approximately 90 seconds, 20 people inside the Broad Arrow Cafe were dead or dying. 12 more were wounded. He then moved into the adjacent gift shop and gallery. People were hiding, trying to escape. Bryant pursued them. He found Nanette Mikac huddled with her 2 young daughters, Alana, aged 6, and Madeline, aged 3. Their mother pleaded with him, "Not my babies." He shot her in the head. He then shot Madeline, and then he shot Alana. He continued through the gift shop area, killing 4 more people, including Dennis Lever and Pauline Masters. He then walked back outside, into the sunshine, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The horror was not contained to the cafe. The sound of the gunfire had alerted those outside, but the initial reaction was confusion. Was it a historical reenactment? A car backfiring? The reality dawned with brutal speed as people began running, screaming. Bryant walked calmly towards the car park. He shot and killed Royce and Carol Thompson as they tried to get into their car. He shot at a tour bus that was attempting to leave, killing the driver, Ian McElwee, and another passenger, Maurice Howard. He moved up the road towards the original toll booth area. There, he found Nanette McCasey's husband, Walter, running with their other child, desperately, trying to find his wife and daughters, unaware they were already gone. Bryant shot and killed Walter Mikac. He shot and killed another woman, Elva Gaylord, and wounded others who were trying to hide among the bushes and cars. He then got into his Volvo and drove towards the exit toll booth. A gold BMW was stopped there, carrying 4 people. Bryant got out of his car, pulled the driver, Robert Salzman, from the vehicle, and shot him dead at point-blank range. He ordered the other 3 occupants, Russell Pollard, Helena Salzman, and Graham Collier, out of the car. He motioned with his rifle for Graham Collier to open the boot. He forced Helena Salzman and Russell Pollard inside, then forced Collier in after them. He slammed it shut. He then got back into his own car and drove to the nearby Port Arthur General Store and Service Station. A woman, Zoe Hall, was in a car with her boyfriend, Glenn Pears, who was inside paying for fuel. Bryant approached the car, produced a handgun, and ordered Zoe Hall into the boot of his Volvo. When Glenn Pears came out of the station, Bryant shot and killed him. With a hostage now in his own car, and 3 more in the stolen BMW, Bryant drove back the way he came, back towards the Seascape guest house where his day of terror had begun. On the way, he fired at a passing car, injuring the occupants. He arrived back at Seascape, forced his 4 hostages inside the house, where the bodies of David and Sally Martin still lay, and the second phase of the atrocity began, the siege. The first police officers arrived at Port Arthur to a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. Bodies lay in the cafe, in the gift shop, in the car park, and on the road. The wounded were being tended to by shell-shocked survivors. The initial reports were chaotic. Was there more than one shooter? Where was he now? The scale of the event was overwhelming for the local police force. Tasmania's elite Special Operations Group, their equivalent of a SWAT team, was activated and dispatched from Hobart, a 90-minute drive away. As law enforcement and emergency services descended on the peninsula, they established a perimeter and began the grim task of counting the dead and evacuating the hundreds of terrified tourists and staff who were still hiding across the sprawling historic site. Meanwhile, Bryant was barricaded inside the Seascape guest house. As night fell, the property was surrounded. The standoff lasted for 18 agonizing hours. Police negotiators tried to make contact. Bryant answered the phone intermittently, his conversations rambling and bizarre. He taunted the police. He demanded a helicopter to take him to the airport so he could fly to Adelaide. At one point he giggled and asked a negotiator, "How many people did I get?" He referred to himself as Jamie. He spoke about his victims in a chillingly detached manner. Throughout the long, cold night, the fate of the hostages inside was unknown, though police held out little hope. As dawn broke on Monday, April 29th, the standoff reached its climax. Bryant set the guest house on fire. Flames and thick black smoke began billowing from the roof. Police believed he was attempting a final suicidal act, or perhaps creating a diversion to escape. He ran from the burning building, his clothes on fire, screaming in pain. SOG officers who had been holding their positions moved in and subdued him. He was taken into custody, suffering from severe burns to his back and buttocks. The siege was over. Inside the smoldering ruins of the guest house, authorities made a final, heartbreaking discovery. The 3 hostages from the BMW, Russell Pollard, Helena Salzman, and Graham Collier, were dead. It is believed Bryant had killed them at some point during the standoff before setting the fire. The body of Zoe Hall, the hostage taken from the service station, was later found in Bryant's abandoned Volvo. The total number of dead had reached 35. A further 23 people were injured. Martin Bryant, the socially outcast boy from Hobart, had done what he promised. He had made everyone remember his name. In the immediate aftermath, Australia was a nation in a state of profound shock and collective grief. The flags flew at half-mast. Vigils were held in cities and towns across the country. The front pages of newspapers were filled with the faces of the victims, men, women, and 2 little girls. The sheer brutality and randomness of the crime struck at the heart of the country's self-image as a safe, peaceful society. But alongside the grief, another emotion was rapidly taking hold. Anger. A deep, visceral anger directed not just at the killer, but at a system that had allowed him to legally acquire an arsenal of military-grade weapons. The political timing of the massacre was, in retrospect, a crucial factor. The new Prime Minister, John Howard, was a traditional conservative from the Liberal Party. His government was expected to be friendly to rural interests and the gun lobby, which were core constituencies for his coalition partner, the National Party. No one expected him to become the country's most significant advocate for gun control. But the horror of Port Arthur changed him. He flew to Tasmania in the days after the massacre, meeting with victims' families and emergency responders. He saw firsthand the devastation wrought by Bryant's semi-automatic rifles. He later said that he felt a moral responsibility to act. He was a father and a grandfather, and the thought of Nanette Mickek pleading for the lives of her 2 small children haunted him. He became convinced that the availability of such weapons was a central part of the problem, and that as the nation's leader, he had to do something. This is where the anatomy of the response truly begins to unfold. Howard announced his intention to pursue sweeping, nationwide gun law reform. The central proposal was radical: a total ban on all semi-automatic rifles and semi-automatic and pump-action shotguns. To be effective, this couldn't be a state-by-state initiative. It had to be a national agreement. Under Australia's federal system, states and territories hold primary responsibility for firearms laws. This meant Howard had to convince every single state premier and territory chief minister, some from his own party, some from the opposition Labour Party, to agree to a unified, restrictive set of laws. The opposition was immediate and fierce. The gun lobby mobilized, arguing that the actions of one deranged individual should not be used to punish millions of law-abiding firearm owners. They organized protests and ran advertisements, framing the debate as an issue of freedom and property rights. Within Howard's own coalition, there was significant resistance. The National Party, representing many rural and farming communities where gun ownership was common, was deeply skeptical. The Deputy Prime Minister, Tim Fisher, a National Party leader and a Vietnam veteran, was initially opposed. The Conservative premiers of Queensland and Tasmania were also reluctant, fearing a backlash from rural voters. The political challenge seemed insurmountable. Howard knew he had a very small window of opportunity. The public's grief and anger were at their peak. He had to harness that momentum before it dissipated into political squabbling. He decided on a high-risk strategy. He would convene a special meeting of the police ministers from all states and territories and push for a single comprehensive agreement. The date was set for May 10th, just 12 days after the massacre. Those 12 days were a blur of intense political maneuvering. Howard and his allies worked the phones relentlessly. They cajoled, they persuaded, they threatened. Howard made it clear that if the states did not agree, the federal government would use its constitutional powers over international trade to ban the importation of such weapons, and would even consider holding a national referendum to override the states, a move that would have plunged the country into a constitutional crisis. He was, in essence, putting his new prime ministership on the line. The public was overwhelmingly on his side. Polling showed massive support for tougher gun laws, with some surveys indicating over 90% in favor. The media was almost universally in favor of reform, keeping the stories of the victims and the horror of the event at the forefront of the national consciousness. This created immense pressure on reluctant politicians. One of the most powerful moments came when John Howard attended a gun rally in Sale, a rural town in Victoria. He was confronted by a hostile crowd of thousands of angry gun owners. He stood his ground wearing a bulletproof vest under his jacket and addressed the crowd, explaining why he believed the reforms were necessary. The images of the Prime Minister standing firm in the face of such intense opposition became iconic, a symbol of his determination. The breakthrough came when key figures were won over. The Labour opposition, led by Kim Beazley, offered immediate and unconditional bipartisan support, removing the issue from partisan politics. This was crucial. It meant Howard was not fighting a war on two fronts. And crucially, Deputy Prime Minister Tim Fisher, after initially hesitating, came around and became a powerful advocate for the reforms within his own rural constituency, a move that required immense political courage. He faced down his own voters and told them that the time for these weapons had passed. On May 10, 1996, the police ministers met in Canberra. The atmosphere was tense. The meeting went for hours, but the political momentum was unstoppable. One by one, the states and territories fell into line. By the end of the day, they had reached a unanimous agreement. The National Firearms Agreement, or NFA, was born. It was one of the most significant moments in modern Australian political history. The NFA was comprehensive and restrictive. Its key provisions included a nationwide ban on the importation, sale and possession of all semi-automatic rifles and all semi-automatic and pump-action shotguns for civilian use. These were recategorized as Category D weapons, available only to military and law enforcement personnel. A national firearm registration system for all guns was established. so that every firearm in the country would be linked to a licensed owner, and a uniform, strict licensing system was created, requiring a genuine reason for owning a firearm. These reasons were limited to specific categories, like hunting, sport shooting, or occupational requirements. Crucially, self-defense was not, and is not, considered a genuine reason to own a firearm in Australia. But the most ambitious part of the agreement was the mandatory buyback scheme. The government would use public funds to buy back all of the nearly 700,000 newly prohibited weapons from their owners at fair market value. The plan was to collect and destroy them. The cost was estimated to be around $500 million. To pay for it, the Howard government introduced a one-off levy on the National Medicare Health Insurance Scheme. Australians were, in effect, being asked to pay a special tax to make their country safer, and they did so with little complaint. The buyback was a logistical and social challenge. Over a 12-month period, more than 650,000 firearms were surrendered to police at designated collection points across the country. They were checked, catalogued, and then destroyed, cut up with angle grinders, melted down in furnaces. The images of vast piles of rifles and shotguns being dismantled were a powerful symbol of the nation's choice. It was a voluntary and overwhelmingly peaceful national disarmament. With the legal framework established and the buyback completed, the question remained, what would be the fate of the man who started it all? Martin Bryant was initially charged with one count of murder. His court-appointed lawyer entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. The prospect of a long, drawn-out trial, forcing survivors and victims' families to relive their trauma in court, horrified the nation. Psychiatrists who examined Bryant found him fit to stand trial, though they confirmed his intellectual disability and personality disorders. They concluded that while he was deeply disturbed, he understood the nature and consequences of his actions. The evidence against him was, in any case, overwhelming. Facing this reality, and under pressure from his own legal team and his mother, Bryant eventually changed his plea. In November 1996, he pleaded guilty to all 72 charges against him, including 35 counts of murder and 23 of attempted murder. The trial was averted. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecution detailed the chilling methodicalness of his rampage. The judge, Sir William Cox, described Bryant's crimes as a catalogue of atrocities, and noted his callous indifference to the suffering he was causing. On November 22, 1996, Martin Bryant was sentenced to 35 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 1,035 years in prison. He was sent to Risdon Prison in Hobart, where he remains to this day confined to a special high-security unit. He has reportedly made several attempts on his own life and has been the target of attacks by other inmates. He will die in prison. The legacy of the Port Arthur massacre is complex. For the survivors and the families of the victims, it is a source of unending pain and grief. But on a national level, the legacy is also one of transformation. The National Firearms Agreement held, and the data suggests it has had a profound impact. Numerous academic studies have analyzed the effects of the 1996 gun laws. While criminology is a complex field and correlation does not equal causation, the trends are striking. In the 18 years prior to the Port Arthur massacre, Australia experienced 13 mass shootings, defined as incidents with 5 or more fatalities, not including the perpetrator. In the 29 years since the laws were passed, there has not been a single one. Furthermore, multiple studies published in respected medical and academic journals, including the Journal of the American Medical Association, have found a significant and accelerated decline in both firearm suicides and firearm homicides in the years following the implementation of the NFA. The rate of gun-related deaths in Australia dropped dramatically and has remained at a lower level since. The laws did not eliminate gun violence, but they fundamentally altered its frequency and its scale. The weapons designed for rapid mass killing were removed from public circulation, and mass killings stopped. What then is the ultimate anatomy of this legislative response? How did a conservative government in a country with a strong tradition of gun ownership in rural areas achieve such a radical reform in just 12 days? It was a confluence of factors, a perfect storm of tragedy and political will. First, the sheer horror of the event. The targeting of women and children in such a beloved location created a moment of national consensus that transcended politics. Second, the existence of strong, determined leadership. Prime Minister John Howard staked his political capital and his personal authority on the issue, refusing to back down in the face of intense opposition from his own base. Third, the gift of bipartisanship. The opposition's support elevated the debate above the usual political fray, presenting a united front. And finally, the nature of the Australian political system, which, when a consensus is reached between federal and state governments, allows for rapid and decisive action, something often impossible in more gridlocked systems. Unlike in the United States, there is no constitutionally enshrined right to bear arms in Australia, making the legal pathway to reform far clearer. The story of Port Arthur is a story of immense loss. 35 innocent lives were extinguished in a few short hours by a man consumed by loneliness and rage. Their loss is a wound that can never fully heal, but their deaths were not entirely in vain. The memory of what happened on that sunny autumn day became the catalyst for a national reckoning. It forced a country to confront a difficult issue and make a collective choice, a choice to value public safety over the unrestricted availability of weapons of war. It demonstrated that a nation, when horrified and united, has the capacity to fundamentally change its own laws to protect its citizens. The legacy of Port Arthur is written not only on the gravestones in Tasmania, but in the legislation that governs an entire continent, a lasting testament to the 35 victims whose memory is now etched into the very anatomy of Australian society. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.